You're listening to Flipping the Channel, conversations with experts and executives from the electronics industry. In each episode, we attempt to understand and unravel some of the business and technical challenges brought on by component obsolescence. Here's your host, Bill Bradford, President of Flip Electronics.
Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Bill Bradford. Thank you for joining this episode of Flipping the Channel. I'm very excited to have as our first guest on this podcast, Ed Smith. Ed is the president, CEO, and board member of SMTC. Ed also spent a significant portion of his career at Avnet Electronics in various executive roles. And prior to that, he was the CEO of Symtec. So Ed, thanks for being here on the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill. I appreciate it.
Let's start, maybe just to fill in the gaps a little bit about your background, how you got to this space, the kind of short story of Ed Smith.
Sure. Started off in the distribution business very early in my career. And, after about 10 years, I decided to go into the EMS space because I said, hey, if I haven't found something hard enough, let me find something even harder. And so going from Avnet to Symtec, after about 3 years, we sold that business to a company called CTS, who ultimately sold the business to Benchmark. So today it's part of the Benchmark family. I then went back to Avnet, which was being nice to be invited back to my old company, and got into the electronics distribution field in a big way. Spent the next 12 years, first as the Senior Vice President of Sales and Operations, and then ultimately for the last 8 years as president of Avnet. Left Avnet and wrote a book. And as I was deciding what to do with that book, SMTC called me and I started working there. And so, the perspective of being both on the customer side and the distribution side, I think really helps understand what's really going on in the marketplace.
So what do you see going on in the marketplace now that you brought it up?
It's really changing as quickly as I've ever seen in my career right now. Things are getting tighter. The wafers and capacity in that part. Technology is changing, getting smaller and smaller, down to 8 nanometers, now 3 nanometers, and continuing. As the technology changes, guess what happens? They end of life parts. Older technologies go away. They need that space and capacity for the newer technologies. And so you have constraint lead times jumping out. You have technology changing, and you clearly have some end-of-life issues going on in the marketplace. This is probably the fastest I've ever seen a change in our marketplace. We had COVID, and that started, and factories closed down. Things got tight, constrained. Then it kind of opened up. Things became very normalized. And then all of a sudden, this demand just went off the charts, mostly driven by electric vehicles, cars, the new electronics in cars. But clearly, the defense arrow being strong and some of the older technologies has clearly created quite the constraint and lead time problem.
So specifically then around some of the obsolescence and end-of-life issues, what is this market kind of done to that space?
It's really exasperated an issue that already happens, right? Normally, companies say, I'm going to have it in the life. They have a year type timing. You try to figure out how many you need. You try to guess the market. Sometimes that works well. Sometimes it doesn't work well. But when the market's moving as quickly as it's moving now, sometimes they run out of wafers and they run out of the opportunity before you even get the opportunity to buy for the end of life. Or they want to stop building it and they have extra wafers and they can use different companies, people like Flip, and sell you the wafer where you can then package it and build it at a later date. But most companies don't want to tie their cash up, in particularly when the COVID-19 issues are going on. Nobody wants to tie cash up into end-of-life products, obsolescence. They'd rather somebody else do that and then use the cash at a later date, even if there's a little bit of a higher costs.
So how have you been dealing with the challenges of the obsolescence parts? What are some of the things you've done at SMTC to try to mitigate the the risks and issues there?
So we'll go into the distribution market like Flip, and we'll say, hey, here's the guess we have for the next year, 2 years, and try to work out a deal where they hold them for the period of time for our customers. Sometimes we'll say, here's what we think we need, and get them to hold the wafer, so it's a less cost on them, and then they can go, realize a finished product later on. And then the last, but the most costly, and this goes to the craziness of the world, is we'll try to ask a customer to redesign their product. And I've had customers, for a $20 part, spend $1 million redesigning a product just because they can't buy a $20 part. And you'd never think of that in the life cycle until you get there. But the reality is, they've made a commitment to build something, but they can't get there without redesigning and being able to get that. So that's the worst outcome that possibly can happen. Holding the wafers is probably the best outcome. And then trying to guess the quantity is probably the middle outcome, and tying up working capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen in this constrained environment too, with mainstream products being tightly allocated. In some cases, customers who can't buy material to build their new product sometimes will go back and build some of the old product if they can get the product. So in this case, when there is end of life material available, sometimes they're going back to the well on designs that are 4 or 5 years old or older, because that's what they can procure components for and book and sell, since the new stuff is so constrained. It's kind of converse to the normal situation where they've got to advance because they can no longer buy the end of life. But I don't know if you've seen those types of examples. But.
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of different things that go on. And some of the products we build, especially in the aerospace and defense, we do a lot of repair for aircraft on ground, AOG. We're FAA certified. And when you got to repair something that may not have been built in the last 10 years, last 20 years, all of a sudden you're starting to try to find something that is not so easily found. And companies like Flip help us out every day. Sometimes we have to go rebuild it. Sometimes we have to redesign it. But the reality is redesigning is very expensive and timely. You're not getting an aircraft back on the ground if you're redesigning a board. So you need to find it or have an alternative solution to get there, for sure.
What's the craziest story you've had trying to obtain and find old, obsolete, end-of-life parts to support a customer?
You just talked about the age of aircrafts and getting aircrafts off ground. We had a gentleman who worked for us that had we built braking systems for the 737, 787. But to do those repairs, he would have every design going back 40, 50 years. He just retired after 60 years with the company. And I would walk in his office and there would be blueprints stacked up, corners all over the place. And you'd say, hey, there's a 737 serial number such and such down. And he would go and find some stack and look through it and finally find the blueprint and say, okay, here's what we need to do this. Here's what happened. And then if you said, well, we can't get those parts anymore, he'd go, let me go look at the blueprint and see if there's a newer one or an older one that we can switch to and still have that going. But when I say, I would say no less than 50,000 blueprints in his office stacked up all over the place. And wow. I used to joke with him that if they ever fell, he'd be pinned underneath there, and we'd have to find him for a week or two underneath all of those different blueprints. So, it's really very complicated stuff and very costly. You don't think about the cost of this obsolescence or not finding a part until you have to do a design that could cost millions of dollars and months worth of work. But it's very costly.
So, IHS tracks end of life notifications as well as PCNs, and they've been noticing a trend that they've not just been increasing year on year, but really starting to accelerate. And I think, Moore's law and just the types of consumer products that are driving volumes today keep those cycles, shorter and shorter, and it gets just tougher and tougher to support the applications that need, a platform that's 5 years plus, in some cases decades old platforms. What steps do you think the industry could take to try to mitigate this? I mean, it seems like we're kind of on this train that's just exacerbating every year with faster acceleration and quicker end of lifing of the older parts.
Yeah, I've always said in the industry, and as you know, I've spent time on this subject pretty extensively. One would be nice that as technologies change, that they always had backward compatibility on the new parts. I know they're faster, I know they're different, but if you could always come out with, if you had a 8-bit microcontroller, or a 16-bit or a 32-bit microcontroller, when you had the next generation, if it could still work with the same software, if it could still work with the same configurations, at least my customers would have to do the least amount of work to upgrade to the newest technology. Same as if you look at FPGA, right? Those are really expensive parts. But when they go end of life and you have no way to upgrade that, you have to completely redesign from beginning to end. It's really, really expensive. So I would think backward compatibility as they make new parts and new technologies come out would really, really, really help. And if you think about it, it should be capable to do that. Our computers work for 5 or 10 years, even though the technology changes every year, right? Wi-Fi changes every year. It gets faster, it gets better. But they make it backward compatible so that if your computer is 5 years old or 10 years old, you don't need a new computer just to operate. And so first would be backward compatibility. Second, that where I think the industry really gets itself, messed up, is there's no consistent way where companies put out the end of life notifications, the PCNs and those type of things. Some companies give a year, some companies give a half a year, some companies give 3 months. And because it's not consistent, what happens is customers, become very flustered when they get it. They don't know if they have 3 months, 6 months, 12 months to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to change or what they need to buy. We just had a part where it had been end of life for a year. But what we did, interesting enough, is we found enough customers that wanted to buy this part that we convinced the manufacturer to go build it for us 4 customers, build up enough demand that it'd be worth building one more set of products. But that's the exception, right? The rule is normally if it was backward compatible and you got enough notification, you can come up with a solution. And then the last, I think, would be really nice is if suppliers would build extra wafers of every set of parts that they built at the end of life. And they froze those parts in nitrogen and held them. And they would take a company like Flip and say, okay, here's the end of life of this set of parts, but here's the wafers for that set of parts. So if customers need them 5 years, 3 years, 10 years from now, you have the capability to certify those parts and recreate those parts. Because if you think about it, they do owe the end customer some responsibility of, hey, I designed your part in, and now I can't make my product because you end the life it with not enough notification or with no way to be backward compatible. So just a couple of those thoughts. There's more, but if you did those 3 things, I think that would solve 95% of the problems.
Interesting. That your first suggestion on the backward compatibility, do you see any either manufacturers or types of components where that's done today or where they've have made attempts to do that effectively?
Probably the biggest ones is more the overall technology, like Wi-Fi. Mm-hmm. Even though they're going to 5G, you'll still have LTE, you'll still have some of the older technology where things will work with multiple technologies for a period of time. But then they'll come to a point and they'll say, okay, when 6G or something else comes out, they'll say, no, we're going to get rid of LTE or we're going to get rid of this or that. It'd be nice if they lasted longer. So I would say the technologies, that's normally good. I would say memory, that normally works pretty well in the memory space.
You can pin out the exact same pinout just with a double density, and just the customer doesn't have to use the excess density, for example.
Exactly. You make some tweaks on the firmware. You can do this, that, but you're not relaying out a board. You're not relaying out parts and doing a lot of change. So there are some technologies. And then you have the what I would call the bigger technologies or the bigger chips, where when they make a change, you're redoing your board, right? You have the MPUs, you have the FPGAs, a lot of the big micros, the graphics chips. When they make a change in those chips, it makes dramatic change. And then for a while, it wasn't even just the hardware. Sometimes they would make a change on the BIOS that would make you redesign your board and do some of those things. So, if they could keep the backward compatibility going, where they had more than one technology built into a chip for a while, that would help a lot.
Right. Very good. What else? Other thoughts in the industry? As you said, you've been kind of a spokesman for our industry. Very involved in industry associations and things for a lot of years. What other burning thoughts you have on kind of the state of the industry right now?
I think the industry is going through a change, and I think it's going to be interesting where it all winds up. Right, the industry has gone through this whole distribution consolidation. And for us, it's not been positive for the end customer. We have less choices of where to buy things. We have less opportunities to negotiate inventory levels, Kanbans. It's really made the situation more difficult. And I'm sure for the distributors, based on looking at the financials, it hasn't been financially apparent that it's been positive for them. And so at some point, the question becomes, where does it go from here? And it'll be interesting to see, but we try to buy more and more parts. We're a global company. We buy more and more globally. Different parts of the world view things differently, and sometimes it's advantageous to us. But clearly with the margins significantly down over the last couple of years, where the distribution channels have been trimmed, anytime you have less choice to buy things and you have lower margins, will give us less choices to get things accomplished. So I'm hoping the industry changes that, goes back to having 3 or 4 distributors per product, but I'm not hopeful that'll happen today or tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And how is SMTC doing? Any news on there you'd like to share?
Well, we just signed an agreement from a company called HIG, a definitive agreement to have them invest a whole bunch of money into us and take us private. So that's always exciting. And then we've really had a good run. I couldn't be happier with the team. We came in here, the company was $130 million 3 years ago. We'll do $450 million this year. So it's been a nice growth pattern for us, clearly. And I think what we do different than most of our other EMS guys that are our size, we focus on the customer. What do they need? How do they need it? How do we be more flexible? How do we be high quality at the same time? And we've used supply chain as a weapon, a positive weapon. We do more Kanbans with our customers than probably anybody. When we look at on-time delivery, it's either there or not there. And that's the way we view things. So we probably view things a little bit differently, and that's paid off so far. So, I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
No, congratulations on that. That's great. A great run so far.
It's been a good run. Let's hope it goes on for a couple more years until I can retire.
So I can't let you off without returning to you mentioned your book. To tell us a little about the book, but you got a chance to make a plug there.
Yeah, so it's not out, published yet, but it will be, and it's called An Ordinary Man in Extraordinary Times, and it talks about the journey of finding your way to giving back more than you take from this world. And when I was a young executive, all I thought about is how to make more money, how to get promoted, and as my wife had passed away and things had happened in my life, it made me reassess that. And interesting enough, the more I gave back, the more charity I did, the more I try to help people one-on-one, the more I got back and the more successful I was. And so it taught me not to just worry about me, but if you worry about the good of the world, positive things will happen. And as you spoke about earlier about being involved with the industry, to me, that's all. Everybody in their industry should be involved, right? It's our industry. It's where we make our money, and we should give back. And that's been one of the things that I've, tried to instill in my children. And, and that's what the book's really about, changing cultures of companies to being more giving than taking of this world.
Well, I look forward to seeing it. We might have to have you back as a guest to specifically plug the book when you release it. You
got it. I'll give you one. I'll even sign it for you for free.
All right. All right, Ed. Well, really appreciate you being on the show. I hope we can get you back on a future episode. As you said, the dynamics in this industry are just changing every day. So what we talk about today is going to be very different. I know 6, 9, 12 months from now. So we'd love to have you back on the show at a later date.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Bill, and you have a great one.
I appreciate it. Thank you for joining this episode of Flipping the Channel. I hope you'll join us in our next episode when our guest will be Greg Wood, Director of Product Management with IHS. And we'll be discussing some of the trends in end of life and process and product change notifications.
You've been listening to Flipping the Channel. This podcast is brought to you by Flip Electronics, where we're making obsolescence obsolete. Visit www.flipelectronics.com for your authorized, hard-to-find, end-of-life electronic component requirements.